So we just got back from CVT, where we all sat in a circle, and somebody gave us a verse which I'd just like to share, because I actually think it's a great backdrop for what we're going to do this afternoon. So 2 Peter 1 verse 19 says these words, says, "We also have the prophetic message as something completely reliable, and you will do well to pay attention to it as to a light shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts." This afternoon. So we've asked Fraser and Greg to come and talk a little bit about the prophetic, and also I've asked Greg to talk a little bit about the creative side of things.
Hey, Greg, you can use the hand mic. Anyway, kia ora koutou. Good to be here, guys. And thank you for taking the time coming and so forth. It's really nice. I just thought I'd introduce a little of my journey in the prophetic and then hand over to Greg, because it really is, this place, just being here, just kind of stirs the bones a little bit, because this is one of the places where I came in contact with Greg, and really it was through here that a lot of the prophetic was sort of opened up and brought alive in my life and in this church and the churches throughout LinkNZ, really. So Greg's always had a big part to do with that. For myself, I think it was about when I was 7, and my parents would have no language to do with this kind of thing. They were from a open brethren background, and the idea of the prophetic, that there wasn't language we used. But at about 7, I had a dream, and went to my parents and just said, "Hey, I've had this dream, and I felt that God showed me a picture that one day I'd be standing before these large crowds of people and doing all this preaching stuff." Now you got to understand, in Suki, the population was of that island was probably about 500 people. So I'd never seen a big crowd, never seen a motor car, never seen a flushing toilet. So it was kind of like, but I had this kind of little vision, and I went to them and said, "Hey, this is what I saw." And because they didn't know how to put language around it, they just kind of said, "Oh, that's nice, son," and basically said, "Go back to bed," which I did. But I look back now, and I realised that is actually a prophetic calling in my life. 40 years, it was when I was 7, and I realised it is through a prophetic way that was awakened in me as a young person. What we really were of someone like Greg is the church is always designed to be a prophetic community. Basically, it'll be a community that will understand something that is of God in her midst. And whenever that stops happening, usually a new church or a new movement is birthed to try and reawaken again the now voice of God in the midst of her. But prophetic communities and prophetic people, there's a song and there's a dance and there's an imagination, there's a freedom that comes in it that just doesn't box us up, I think, to where some of the prophetic can go, either leading people to judgment and all that kind of stuff. But there's something about the prophetic that actually releases the body to sing again and to find its dance again. And we are a prophetic people. I'm going to ask Greg questions, and he's free to answer those for 1 minute or 20 minutes, depending on how he feels. Hey, Greg, thank you, and put our hands together and just receive him. And you want to go this way? Or? Tell us a little bit of your story, connect us with your story, and in that, your natural story, but also where the prophetic started to be awakened in you. So.
Okay. I don't. I never had a paradigm for what the prophetic was, I think the closest I ever got to it was when we were kids. I remember my mum having a séance, and so I think as kids we decided we'd try and do that, just to see if that sort of paranormal stuff was real, but I got bored, so I pushed the glass, and everybody freaked out, so that was probably my initial introduction to sort of paranormal stuff, of which I haven't continued to do. Okay, so just as long as you understand that. So I didn't come from a church background family. Other than my dad saying to me one day that when he grew up, my grandfather, my papa, who was very fascinated with spiritual things. In fact, he used to say he spent 50 years of his life looking for God. Took my dad to the Spiritualist church Sunday school. And it probably wasn't until my grandfather, my papa, had a stroke and was in hospital that I visited him when God spoke to me and said that he was an unredeemed prophet. And that the gift that was in him would be redeemed in my generation.
welcome again to the Who Ya Come Home podcast, and this week we've got the fantastic Mr. Greg Burson. But yeah, Greg has a unique skill set, an incredible prophetic gifting that he operates in. Before we go any further, I just want to introduce Erin. Kia ora, Erin.
Kia ora.
Erin and I are going to be listening through this podcast, and we're going to be throwing comments in and out, helping to maybe bring some clarity to concepts that Greg talks about as we go through this podcast. So Erin and I thought the cool thing would be just to jump in and say a few comments. Quick rundown of maybe some glossary terms that Greg might talk about. A word Greg uses is numinous.
Numinous.
Yes.
Sounds very rebellish.
Very rebellish, yes. Which means,
I don't know what numinous means.
we get the word numinology from it, which is spirituality.
Oh.
Numinous is another way to talk about spirituality and spiritual things.
So you could just say spiritual?
Another word that Greg uses is the term clairvoyant. But if you are listening to this podcast and you have never heard that term, or you've only heard that term in the context of horoscopes, witchy poo, whatever, don't freak out. The term clairvoyant very simply means to see clearly.
Yep. To be able to see things clearly in the spirit?
In the spirit, yes. So Greg uses that in the term of a gifting that all of us, to some degree, have the capacity to be clairvoyant. And of course, another couple of terms: orthodoxy, orthopraxy.
Orthopraxy sounds like
orthodoxy to do with your
chiropractor
ideas, doctrines, whatever it is, what you believe, systems.
Orthopraxy, like practicing the orthodox. So orthodoxy means kind of the system of what you believe. Is that right? Orthodoxy is like what you believe, kind of like the package of what you believe, and orthopraxy is kind of how you practice what you believe.
Yes, how you practice it. Yes. He uses a term coming up called perennial philosophy. Your perennial basically.
Can I just ask you, like, it's like, can I guess?
Yes.
Because I'm just thinking as a gardener, perennial and annual flowers.
Okay. Like, so what does perennial flowers mean?
Well, I think that means like that's a seed that keeps on, like, year after year, it keeps on going. Whereas annual, you have to replant it.
Woohoo!
So how does he use it?
It means, sort of perennial philosophy means like an ongoing tradition, a perpetual tradition, an ongoing way of thinking.
That's nice.
He uses the term univocity. I can't find it in the dictionary.
But he does claim that he found it in the dictionary. What do you think it means, univocity?
I think it just means universal, the oneness, the universal, the oneness. That's another term he uses. Annihilation.
Yep.
Annihilation is a doctrine of hell, which talks about how in the afterworld, when people are confronted with God, they are annihilated. So they don't exist. They're
not actually tormented in hell. They actually just go into non-existence.
So there's three types of hell. There's
three types of ideas of hell.
Three types of ideas of hell. One is universalism, which is we will live forever, whatever. Which there are layers within that. One's annihilationism, which means you are annihilated. The other one is eternal conscious torment, which is typically your typical view of hell. So anyway, but by way of example, Greg does talk about annihilationism. All right, here we are with the fantastic Mr. Greg Burson. Greg.
Kia ora.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good.
So cool, Waikwe, who are you? Nohikwe, where are you from?
Okay, I'm from Auckland. I was born here.
I guess the first question really to start off with is, a very simple one, like, what were the things that had you become a Christian? A follower of Christ, per se?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a home where, even though my mother went to a Sunday school and still has quite a good take on her Bible. My father grew up in a home where my papa was a deeply spiritual man, and has his roots in the Spiritualist church and the Theosophical Society. Searched for God all his life. I think my dad probably went to a spiritualist Sunday school at some stage.
Right.
So I didn't bump into the idea of church attendance or being a part of a church community till I was 19, when a friend of mine's sister was a part of a street outreach team from a local Baptist church. We walked into an interesting environment where the people there were overly friendly, something that I'd never experienced growing up. I always struggled to find friends. So now that I was a Christian, I was in, and before I was out.
Right.
And so I'm a part of the favoured few who have found Christ.
Right.
Which I later came to realise that I actually didn't find Christ. The Christ mystery found me.
Okay.
And awakened, rather than me finding something, I've actually come to latterly believe that something awakened in me.
Yeah.
That maybe was already at work in me. I was just unaware of it.
But you know, you're a phenomenal Christian leader. You have, you know, the understanding of what we might call the prophetic, or being a seer, seeing things.
So what the church did was it sort of awakened me to the idea of my spirituality as a deep-seated part of my imago Dei, my God-imaged self, the numinous, the numinous, you know, that part of us that has a supernatural awareness, a psychic ability, a clairvoyance, so to speak.
Right.
I think it's in all of us. For me, when I started going to church, it opened that conversation up in me, and I started to experience an awakening in my life that I think has been a part of my heritage.
Right, wow.
Through my mother's family line, through my grandfather's family line. I think there was prophetic leanings in my family generations that the church afforded me permission to start asking questions about.
Wow.
Back then, the questions are different to what they are now. The question back then was, now that you are a Christian, you have received the ability to do this, versus now I would say, no, I always had the ability to do it, but the Christian language or the Christian faith was the doorway that I came through to open my internality up to the possibility of something more.
Wow. You know, look out, there's a demon and everything. Or, you know, to, let's just say, hyper-Pentecostalism, hyper-spirituality, you know, that, let's just say, is dualistic. How have you journeyed out of that way of being?
I think I'm still journeying out of it. I think the thing that I'm grateful for with the church that I, started to find my way into an understanding of God was that it was a Baptist church that had a charismatic or a Pentecostal leaning, and that gave the advantage of having something solid in the orthodoxy and something quite interesting in the orthopraxy. Okay. The experience of spiritual phenomena, some kind of ecstatic experience of God. And so, I'm really grateful for that. I think for me, it was very separate. It was kind of like that idea that there was more to me than my own spirituality, and that combined with the body and other numinous experience, supernatural moments, my lean is a more mystical way of understanding spirituality, which is
explain that.
A deep-seated union with God. The mystics believed in the idea that at some level all of humanity is connected to God, not just as image bearers, but also as with the Great Spirit, or God.
Right.
And to lean into a more non-dual way of understanding of spirituality, that the mystics would say, no, you are a living soul that is a fusion of spirit and matter that came together and have always been together. You know, when Christianity introduced me to the idea of redemption and salvation, I saw it as kind of an evacuation plan, an evacuation guarantee that when I die, I would be saved and I wouldn't go to hell.
Right.
Reading
who would some of those be? Who are some of the mystics?
Probably more recently, the one that I would read a lot would be Richard Rohr. You know, I think people like St. Francis and Clare, Meister Eckhart, Thomas Merton, of course, is probably credited with really awakening the whole contemplative side of mysticism.
Yeah, right.
You know, back in the 60s, I think.
Right.
But it's not foreign to indigenous cultures.
Right.
Indigenous cultures have always believed that we is in union with spirit and union with God.
Right.
I love the idea of the perennial philosophy that believes at the deep heart of all religious orientation is a belief in the betterment of humanity as it becomes more one as humans, or all things become more one with God. Hence the John 17 prayer, you know. I pray that they would be one as we are one. So we're union, univocity, oneness, you know.
Oh man, numinous, univocity?
I read the dictionary
glossary
on my day off.
That's called glossary Burson.
On my day off, I read the dictionary, you know.